Monsters. Scary, loud freaks of nature and creations that hide under our beds and terrorize us in the night. To many, the Universal monster films, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, etc., are the kings of horror. While these films undoubtedly defined the horror landscape for decades to come, their sequels, Daughter of Dracula, The Bride of Frankenstein, and The Invisible Man Returns, came out of a time when religious gatekeepers were strict and swift to edit, cut, and alter the sequels as they saw fit. But is it as bad as it seems? Were the pre-code originals truly better? Did the beastly MPA and petrifying madman Joseph Breen truly affect the horror genre? In this poorly timed essay, that is what we'll seek to answer, as we are about to unfold a tale of the most horrific monster any filmmaker can face: censorship. The first batch of films listed, Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Invisible Man, all came out in the pre-code era of Hollywood. For those of you not familiar, pre-code Hollywood is an era prior to 1934, rampant with sex, violence, drugs, scandalous romances, and anti-heroes. All the good stuff audiences of the Great Depression needed to get into theater seats. These were the good times. We'll start by looking at the most tame one to come out of them, Dracula. By modern standards, the film is pretty slow and content-wise pretty tame. However, by 1931 standards, the film is pretty intense. A handful of vampiric killing and many scenes which appear to be sexually charged. Just take a look at Dracula as he descends onto the female lead. This scandalous horror was raved about and incredibly popular regardless of the film's less than proper content. This is described in the issue of the Film Daily, published at the time of Dracula's release. Wherever it is showing, it is setting new records and taking the people by storm. The next release, Frankenstein, is unlike Dracula. This film is dark even by modern standards. Lots of dead bodies, brains, strangling, general killing, lots of talk about being better than God, and more importantly, the killing of a kid. This particular problem was a huge issue for censorship boards across the country, even though the film was released in the pre-code era. The Motion Picture Herald describes this struggle in Kansas in the words of critic John C. Moffat. The picture was barred outright from the state when the board found 32 scenes or sequences objectionable. The parts objected to by the censors, if cut, would eliminate one half of the film. However, Kansans and many others across the states objected. Also in this article from the Motion Picture Herald is stated, Kansas is up in arms over the action of the state censor board in barring Frankenstein from the entire state. Protests are said to be pouring into the board from all sides, and newspapers are adding their voice to the general resentment. So, even though the censors were furious, it is clear monster films continue to be successful. Last in the lineup is The Invisible Man. Although no child murder, the reign of Jack Griffin is horrific. Like Frankenstein, there's plenty of talk about being God, defying God, and just general violence. Unlike Frankenstein, the Invisible Man derails a whole passenger train. And sends his ex-partner in a car down a cliff with no ability to stop it.
Goodbye.
This insanity of a film proved to be just as successful as the last two. Critics raved about The Invisible Man. They write in October's issue of the Motion Picture Daily from 1933. Frightful, even dreadful in conception, the film is kept believable all the way. James Whale's direction creates and holds illusion, carry the excitement to well-timed climaxes. From these films alone, it is obvious the massive success of this scary and intense content amongst audiences of the 30s. Universal was creating hits left and right, cementing more monsters with every new adaptation. But those times did not last. After a lot of complaints from mostly Catholic communities, the creation of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America in 1922, and a pretty relaxed attempt made by William H. Hayes to regulate content in films, the first version of The Code was submitted by a man named Martin Quigley. Hayes liked it, and his office did their best to plead with filmmakers to abide by the code. Producers didn't really care, the Hayes administration was mocked, and the Catholics were getting even more frustrated with the state of cinema. In response, the Ultra-Catholic Legion of Decency was founded, they started rating films, Cardinal Daughtry founded an absurd Catholic boycott of cinema, which led to even more complaints. Eventually, the whole thing became a government issue, with Democrats and Republicans looking for regulation all over. Sick of everything, the Producers and Studios of America founded the Production Code Administration. Hayes took a backseat, and the total anti-Semitic wad, Joseph Breen, took complete oversight of every film coming out of Hollywood, imposing strict rules and a boatload of fines if they weren't followed, thus ushering in an era of heavily censored and regulated films after 1934. With that vague and long-winded explanation underway, we can get back to the horror. The sequels to the pre-code horror films, Daughter of Dracula, The Bride of Frankenstein, and The Invisible Man Returns all came out after 1934, amidst the harsh censorship of the PCA and Joseph Breen. First, in this lesser era of monsters, is The Bride of Frankenstein. When putting this film up against its dark gothic predecessor, the differences are astounding. The monster feels like less of a monster in this one. He's less violent, and the tone of the film overall is much more lighthearted. The monster is more inclined to prance through the forest, drink, and smoke this time around. Most of this terror downgrade is on account of the massive edits thrown at it by the PCA, according to the website Horror Film History. Joseph Breen's office objected to the sex. Shots of Elsa Lanchester's cleavage were cut, as was the implication that Mary Shelley, Byron, and Shelley were all living together in sin, and the violence, reported 21 deaths, were reduced down to 10 by the censor scissors. Although tonally a little campier and heavily cut, the film still had instances of horror, made a whopping $2 million at the box office, and was incredibly popular amongst critics. As stated in Universal Weekly, "Never in the history of Universal has a picture so early been booked so avidly as The Bride of Frankenstein. The critics of every city have hailed it as a marvelously effective piece of entertainment." Then came The Daughter of Dracula. Sure, there's some violence in this one, but there is not nearly as much action in this piece. There is for sure a large amount of sexual undertones, but not as much as the original writers intended. As it was, the original script penned in 1935 by the Invisible Man screenwriter R.C. Sheriff was revised and rejected 4 times before being entirely abandoned and rewritten by Dracula screenwriter Garrett Fort. Let's just also say, Joseph Breen was not a fan of the intense lesbian undertones and modeling scene from the film. Yet, even amongst the rewrites and censorship, just like its predecessor, the film still appeared to be a hit. Once again from Universal Weekly. "If anyone who saw Dracula, that tremendous thriller which started a cycle of thrilling success and box office profit, thinks that this was the tops in the horror business, just let them see the flaming 500-year-old daughter do her stuff in Universal's sequel, Dracula's Daughter." Lastly produced, The Invisible Man Returns is subject to the biggest action and horror degrade. There's no mass murder in this sequel, just some light threats and minor mischief. Unlike the few other films in this list, it was incredibly difficult to dig up records on the censorship present in The Invisible Man Returns. However, we can reference letters found in the MPAA archive regarding the first Invisible Man, and make assumptions based on this and the plot, how the script may have been affected by the code. James Wingate, an enforcer of the code, which keep in mind was present at the time of the first Invisible Man, just unenforced, states, "With regard to official censorship, it seems to us that the story should prove reasonably free of difficulty. However, it might be wise to avoid any action which may seem overly brutal in connection with various killings." Even though the action was most likely dimmed, once again, the audience's love for the genre and franchise kept them coming back to theaters. The Box Office Digest acknowledges this. "Universal has a much better than average picture this week in its new release, The Return of the Invisible Man. The picture has opened up quite well at a 102% average." Now, with an understanding of the original films, their sequels, how they succeeded, and how they were censored, we can return to the question, did censorship really do anything? Sure, the PCA and Joseph Breen went and adjusted whatever fitted their Catholic agenda, but the sequels still fared well. Even though when looking at the modern ratings of these films, the sequels all seem to be received critically lower than their predecessors. However, I've left out one key fact in all of this. To truly show how censorship affected the genre, we can look at Breen's massive campaign to play up UK's horror film ban in 1935. When word that UK film boards were being particularly harsh on horror, Breen latched on, spreading a campaign of misinformation regarding the reception of horror films in the UK. He told Hollywood studios not to bother with horror, that they'd be missing out on a huge market, and when horror scripts came Breen's way, he ensured they stayed in production hell through a confusing note and PCA approval process, effectively causing a dry spell for the horror genre as a whole. Fortunately, various screenings of old Dracula and Frankenstein prints saved the genre and thrusted Universal and other studios back into horror. A code pushing a behind-the-scenes propaganda effort that is actively trying to halt the production of horror is truly the final stake in Breen's heart. This horrific tale of censorship can only come to one conclusion, one that is true throughout the entire reign of the MPA and the stories of its effects on other genres. When it comes to horror, censorship does nothing but dilute the project's potential, starve fans of better content, and create a system that is fundamentally against horror as a genre.